Sometimes a love of playing role-playing games can turn into something even greater, and you might want to design and publish your own role-playing game. It's a pastime I wholeheartedly endorse, and one that obviously, as the runner of a publisher in Desks and Dorks, I have found great fulfillment in. And so today we're going to talk about how to make your RPG for cheap. Hi, I'm Kyle, I'm the Dork, you're watching Desks and Dorks. A couple things. The YouTube pleasantries would go quite a long way to help us if you like the work that we are producing. 2, this is a follow-up video to a piece I did on the fundamental flaws and issues therein in Dungeons & Dragons. During that video, I brought up how I dislike the use of AI-generated art by a company like Wizards of the Coast, and I said that it was pretty much unconscionable that a company with the resources that Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro has should use AI art when it could very easily pay and support the ecosystem of artists that have helped to make the game a smash success. I was much more understanding of creators and individuals who are cash strapped and as a result find, whatever way they can to make their games work. And I brought up that there's actually a ton of resources available to people who want to do cheap art for your games. And so people asked, I said I would make a full video. That's what this one is. Links to every one of these resources, every one of them, will be in the description below. I'm not going to gatekeep a single thing. With that out of the way, let's talk about it. So what we're going to explore, how to make your games, where to sell your games, and how you can do this on your own. I think it's really important for us to go over each step of the process, and I also think it's important for me to include those resources for you. A lot of this video is going to be focused on how to make your game look good and where you can find assets to help you do so without having to rely on the stolen work of other artists. With that out of the way, let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about are asset groups or asset pages. There are an entire cottage industry of artists that make their living selling bulk assets for games. Now, traditionally, these are used for video games, but they can be very easily used and adapted to a tabletop role-playing game, particularly if you're imaginative in how you do your layout. So I'm going to show you 2 of the places that I have found not just free resources, but also cheap and affordable ones as well, if you're trying to design something that is reminiscent of a pixel art adventure. The first place I would encourage you to go to is to itch.io. They have a game assets page, and as you can see, literally it's about 70,000 results. Now, again, you're gonna have to do a little bit of digging. A lot of times I feel like the AI art argument boils down to, I don't want to do the legwork. And in this case, it's really actually not all that hard to do the legwork. You do have to sift through some stuff, but you can find some really great art bundles and art assets, particularly if you're going to make an RPG or a TTRPG that is reminiscent of pixel-based video games. This is a really cool place to find music as well. If you're somebody who likes to have ambient noise or sound to go along with your tabletop role-playing experiences, that's a really great way to do so as well. And I would encourage you to sift through the stuff on the itch.io page. And there's also, of course, free stuff as well that you can gain access to so long as it is attributed properly when you publish your work. Another one that I found that I think is pretty neat is craftpix.net. I haven't used this one for any of my projects personally, but it works very similarly to itch.io in that you can just purchase these assets and they will be readily available for you should you need icons or things like that. That's another great use for these bulk sets, is that if you need icons or things for a UI, just like ability icons, things like that, stuff for your character sheets, little symbols to go along with that, text boxes, for example, if you want flourishes to go with a text box to draw a reader's attention, these can be a great way to do that. And again, it's relatively affordable. You can get stuff like 50, 60, 100 images for anywhere from $5 to $25, which is totally within a budget of even a modest creator or a modest creative work. Another thing that I would encourage you to do is find artists that have licensable work. The best place to do this I have found is DriveThruRPG. The one that I really liked was, this is Dean Spencer. He is, full disclosure by the way, none of these services have paid me to talk about them. They're all stuff that I have either used or know somebody that has used these before. So no, I'm not getting paid or sponsored. I'm not shilling for anyone else's work. Just want to make that clear. I probably should have made that clear in the intro, but regardless, this is Dean Spencer. Dean Spencer is part of another cottage industry on DriveThruRPG that works by making essentially licensable work for your games. So essentially what happens is you can pay for the use of, like, let's look at this half page right in the middle of the screen of this thief sort of like brandishing their axe by the campfire. You could license that one for your game. But if you're looking for stuff to fill out the pages of your books rather than have to pay for additional unique work, this is a really great way to do so. And licensing this art is actually really affordable. The half sheets, for example, a lot of these half sheet pages were about $3.50. There was some cover art that's about $15 to $16. Now, again, one of the things, and one of the counter arguments is, but this isn't going to be unique, but Dan Spencer is one of several thousand artists that I was able to locate on DriveThruRPG that do this kind of work, and he has several hundred different pieces of art. So the odds are that if you are going to be buying and licensing art like this for commercial use from an artist, it is going to feel unique because there's so many people doing it, and the rate is so reasonable anyway. Now, again, you're not going to own the art. That is a double-edged sword here. If you wanted to, say, start selling merch with this, you might have to enter into another agreement with him. And I'm going to issue this caution right now. Always be sure that you are understanding what you're buying before you work with or pay anyone for these services. So make sure that it is licensable for commercial work. For example, one of the artists that I looked at, not Dan's, but another artist that I looked at had really, really affordable art that was free to use in playtest materials, but was not licensable if it was going to go to commercial use. So just make sure that you read the fine print when you hire an artist like this. But again, $15 to $16 for a really solid fantasy cover art, and $3.50 to $7 for stuff to fill out different pages in your rule books is absolutely awesome, and it's totally worth doing if licensing art is the route that you want to go. Very, very cheap, and again, you can find some really high quality stuff on DriveThruRPG that's just like this. I cannot recommend this highly enough. The best one, though, and I'm not going to gatekeep this, this is my favorite resource. This is a resource that I think is absolutely the most important one here that you're ever going to be able to use. This is the glorious U.S. Library of Congress. In addition to what the Library of Congress usually does, is it maintains the copyright for stuff that has fallen into public domain. And then what happens is when that stuff, if it has been deemed culturally or historically important, once it falls out of copyright, it enters into a section of free to use commercial images and resources. What's really cool about this is not only do you have legal precedent if anybody ever decides to come after your work, because the Library of Congress is the one that maintains those collections, maintains those resources, but the library does actually continue to maintain high-resolution scans of all of the images. There are literally, and I mean this with all the love in my heart, there are millions of free images, free art, free assets that are available for commercial use and distribution through the Library of Congress. And this is an absolute gold mine. I'm just going to show you a couple things that I found. I did 10 minutes of searching for stuff, and immediately I had to resist making different rough drafts for different RPGs. But for example, do you want accurate period made topographical and geographical maps of the U.S. during the Civil War? These maps date from anywhere from 1859 to 1863, and they are awesome high-resolution scans. So if you're making a Wild West or a Weird West inspired game, you could use those Civil War maps for all kinds of stuff. I also found, by the way, not patent information, but licensed firearm pictures and things like that, firearm schematics on the library as well that were free for use. Really, really cool stuff if you're into black powder weapons. So if you're like a Weird West or Wild West guy, I think that'd be a great use for your time. If you're a big fan of Call of Cthulhu, or you want a historical accurate one, I know the Call of Cthulhu Regency book just came out this year. There's an entire catalog of pictures of the Ottoman Empire in the Victorian era, 18,000 pictures, in fact. I pulled a couple that I thought were interesting. This is a hospital ward and also a antique collector's display piece of antique Ottoman weapons, medieval Ottoman weapons. So these are perfect if you're handing out dossiers for your Call of Cthulhu or your cult adventurers and investigators. It's super, super cool, really evocative, and it's not going to cost you a single red cent, which I think is absolutely spectacular. And if you're like me and a big fan of The Witcher 2 and how it uses this kind of odd, like mid 1300s, 1400s esque or 1500s esque map style for like how it treats a world map. It also, the Library of Congress maintains a collection of Sir Francis Drake's voyages. These are literally like illustrated from those voyages, and they were distributed as like, I don't want to call them propaganda necessarily, but they were distributed after Drake's voyages. You can use these. I think these are absolutely sick if you're doing like an era of exploration, or you're doing something set on the high seas. If you're like a black powder person or a pirate Borg person, I think these maps are absolutely spectacular, and they're super, super evocative. And these are just a small smattering of some of the things that I found on the Library of Congress's image database. Please, for the love of all that is good and holy, you can make really compelling stuff using images and art that you get for absolutely nothing. And it's a shame that we're turning our backs on really cool art that exists in order to basically make mid-journey generated slop that kind of looks like everything else. Again, seriously, if you have not checked out the Library of Congress's free for use archive, it is so cool and is so much worth your time. I cannot recommend this resource enough. But then let's talk about how you might want to release your own game. Obviously, if you want to distribute and make your games, you might want to generate some amount of revenue from it, or at least find some way to distribute it to your friends and family, or just to people online who are interested in playing your role-playing game. And there's a couple different ways that you can go about this. For your first project, I would highly encourage you to simply do a PDF. I think this is just the best thing to do. And you want to see what this would be like for you. You can distribute all of your PDFs on itch.io. This is the one that I would recommend first and foremost if you are simply doing digital copies of your games. The reason I recommend itch.io over other ones is they actually take a lower percent cost of the PDF. Traditionally, when you distribute on a digital storefront, they will be taking a percentage of every sale that you make as a result of them hosting the service for free. This is a totally reasonable transaction. Just like, I think if last time I checked, I think itch.io's take was about 15 to 20%, depending on the amount of sales that you generate. This is completely and totally reasonable. It's the reason that all of our Desks and Dorks PDFs are available on itch.io, and it's the reason that I have moved away from this second one, which is DriveThruRPG. Now, the advantage to DriveThruRPG as opposed to itch is that DriveThru has a lot more brand recognition. You will get a lot more people who tend to troll through DriveThruRPG looking for cool PDFs, looking for interesting digital products. However, I do believe DriveThruRPG takes more of a cut on digital products than I think is fair, at least for me at this point in running my business. However, the advantage to this is that DriveThru sometimes will drum up really good marketing for you in the form of bundles and sales. Now, I do think that that advantage of DriveThrus is dropping over recent years. Itch.io does a ton of cool stuff in the form of game jams and bundles, so I see this as something that is still an advantage of DriveThruRPGs, but it's an advantage that I do think is dwindling as time goes on. However, there's nothing stopping you from releasing your game on both platforms, and that is an advantage if you are trying to reach the widest possible audience. And of course, if you're just somebody who's trying to do this as opposed to someone like me who runs a business and you have to weigh that kind of stuff, you might be like, well, I don't really care if I make a little less money on DriveThru. I just want the most amount of people to see my game. At which point, that's a totally reasonable understanding, and you and I have very different goals, but just be aware that those are two options that are readily available to you. And if you want to, let's say you want to just give your game away for free, which is totally cool as well. If you're just making something for the love of the game, quite literally, you can distribute on itch.io and DriveThruRPG totally free. There's no fees attached to that as well. It's a great way to get your game out there and to participate in some game jams or some free bundles just to get your name out there and to get people interested in the work that you are making. One last word of caution: if you are hoping to get tons of eyes and publicity on these sites, you're going to have to do a lot to differentiate yourself. Both of these are very saturated markets, so just be aware that although you can put your stuff out on RPG and itch.io, the likelihood of you achieving a sort of virality or fame from that are pretty low. I know some people are like, I'm going to put it on itch.io and I'm going to generate 1,500 sales. Probably not. But you will be able to at least direct people to your storefront and to the ability to get your game, which, if you're a first-time RPG designer, is worth its weight in gold. The other one that I want to talk about is actually just going to your friendly local game store. A lot of times, friendly local game stores are exactly that. They are friendly, they are local, and they're people like you, people that have a passion for games, people that have a passion for making stuff, that have a passion for showing people cool, new, and intriguing products. And as a result, they might be, at the very least, receptive to the work of an independent artist such as yourself, or an independent publisher like us. The best thing that you can do is literally just go down and have a conversation with them. This works particularly if you're already part of that local community, so it doesn't feel like a sales pitch. I know that for me, that was like one of the really difficult things when I first got started, was approaching game stores and asking them if they were interested in carrying our games. I hate feeling like I'm selling something to people, but if you're already part of it, like let's say you go down and you play Friday Night Magic, or you're part of a Wednesday night board game meetup, then you're going to have an in already. And when you start talking about your project, you can say, hey, are you interested in maybe potentially carrying my game? The way that I would frame this to make this very easy for them to say yes is two things. One, limit the amount of copies that you require a store to take. I would limit this to probably anywhere from 3 to 6. This allows a store to take a small footprint and see how it sells. Most game stores that I know, at least most of the friendly local ones that are not big stores, buy things in small amounts, because who knows what your potential clientele is going to want to purchase. And I'll be honest, this is going to sound harsh, but product that sits on a shelf and doesn't sell is wasted money and wasted opportunity. And when you're running a small business, you have to be pretty aggressive about what you sell and how often it sells. And so if you're just limiting it to 3 to 6 copies, that's totally fine. The other thing that I would encourage you to do when you're having those conversations is to frame it on a consignment model. But essentially a consignment model is, let's say you put 3 of your copies of your game, you sell the game for, let's say, $10. The store agrees to take 20% of each sale, and so the store doesn't have to buy the inventory outright, which is a really good thing for the store, and the store makes money when you make money. And so there's a vested interest in both of you kind of continuing to support each other. That's the way that I would frame that conversation if you're going into a local game store and you want to have the talk about, hey, are you willing to sell my game? I think that's the best way to approach it. It's frames it as a way of mutual benefit rather than just a transaction that is done for the sake of money. So again, if you're one of those people like me who tends to struggle a little bit with selling your product, that's a good way to have and frame that conversation. And if you're already part of a local game store or local gaming environment, I think it's a pretty easy conversation to hopefully have, and it's one that I wish somebody had talked me through before I started running a business. So hopefully that's a helpful thing for all of you as well. Now, let's say you want to release a physical edition. There are a couple different pitfalls here that I want to walk you through, things that I wish I had learned when we launched our first game about 5 years ago. The biggest one is finding a printer. I'm going to caution you all right now. I would find a printer that works in whatever country that you are in. So for me, it's the continental United States. So I know a lot of people in the indie TTRPG community are using a company called Mixum. I went through, their prices seem pretty reasonable. I haven't used Mixum personally. We have our own printer that I work with, but Mixum is one that has come recommended to me by a number of different independent creators that I have worked with in the past, and so I have that on pretty good authority that they're a decent publisher. But what's cool about a company like Mixum is you can go onto the site, you can play around with the parameters of your game, and you can see exactly how much it's going to cost you per unit. This is really important because you want to know exactly how much you're going to spend, and I'm going to go over how to budget for your project in just a little bit. But it's really important for you to know your margins when you're getting started. The other reason I'm going to encourage you to use a printer in your own country is that in doing so, customer service and customer care is much easier to accomplish than if you were doing something overseas. It's much easier for you to resolve a shipping issue when it happens within your own continental jurisdiction than it is for you to do this when it is overseas. For example, right now, we're in the middle of coordinating with a company in China that's doing some manufacturing and some production work for us. And the cost and the quality are excellent, but it's been very difficult and it's cost us time because obviously the language barrier is reasonably substantial, and that's had to change some of the parameters of how we work on a project. So something that was supposed to have been done a couple weeks ago is still in the process of getting accomplished right now. And that was a necessary risk, and it's a risk I understood when I entered into an agreement with that business, but it's not a risk that you're going to have when you're working with a publisher or a printing house that is within your own country. I would recommend doing this for your first game just because you want to focus on making the game as good as possible and getting it to your customer rather than worrying about quality assurance or printing costs or printing issues, things that might arise. So again, focus on a printer that is in your country, at least for your first couple releases. You can also do something called print on demand. This is another advantage that DriveThruRPG does have. I know a number of independent creators that either because of where they live, so let's say for example New York or Texas, they're limited on space if they're living in an urban environment, so they don't have the ability to stash inventory for themselves and ship it to customers on a case-by-case basis. And so what they do is they set up a print-on-demand service with DriveThruRPG. This has a number of advantages. I already talked about the space, but the other advantage is that you don't have to pony up the money up front to produce, ship, and distribute your own game. That falls squarely on the consumer. Now, however, because of this, the double-edged sword part comes in where you have to actually have the consumer spend more money and you get less of it because a print-on-demand service is going to eat up a lot of the benefit and a lot of the cost. So unless you're passing that on to the consumer, you're going to have to eat that into the profit margin. Again, that's totally reasonable and totally okay, but you have to be prepared to lose money on the back end if you are going with a print-on-demand service. One more thing I will mention as an advantage to print-on-demand as opposed to printing and distributing it yourself is that customer service is handled by somebody else. I'm going to actually share an anecdote from another fellow designer. Shout out to my boy Bear. Bear, you're the GOAT, dude. Bear is a wonderful designer, but he made a game called Project Biomotus, which is essentially Ghost in the Shell meets Mad Max. It's a fantastic little RPG, and I say little in quotes because the book is like 400 plus pages of like full color glory. It's beautiful. In any case, Bear went through DriveThruRPG to publish and to print it. He didn't do print on demand. He actually had them print the books for him. But when there were issues with the books after they arrived, DriveThruRPG handled the shipping and the replacement copies totally and completely free. This is another advantage to going with a service like DriveThruRPG. So again, Bear made less money on the back end, but was able to not have to worry about the hassle of replacing that person's book or dealing with that customer. That falls on the person that is running that service. So there's advantages and disadvantages to everything. I'm going to caution you all right now to do your homework, and that leads me into my last thing. Know your margins, please. This is the one thing I wish somebody had laid out for me before I started owning a company and distributing games as a business. Knowing your margin is so important. Now, if you've never taken an economics class or you've never worked in business before, a margin is just how much money do I make on an individual product, and knowing how much you're going to spend and knowing how much an individual book unit part of your game is going to cost is so essential. And it's something that a lot of people who style themselves as artists or writers don't think about prior to going into their first project. So the biggest thing is please have a budget in mind when you're starting your project. It's very easy for people to get lost in the sauce when you're making something that you're passionate about. This is your baby. It's something you care about so deeply and you want it to succeed. However, I'm going to caution you, please do yourself a favor and budget it beforehand. I promise you, the simplicity of having a budget will save you from so many headaches. And it will let you know exactly how much you stand to make once everything is said and done. That includes budgeting a little extra padding in case of sudden expenses. Case in point, I had to replace 20 damaged copies of one of our games that came through in transit. I wasn't planning on having to replace those, but because I budgeted correctly, I was able to do so without losing my shirt. Again, that sounds like a small thing. I know it sounds like a basic thing, but I know plenty of individuals who don't budget. Please also make purchases that make your game better. You should be focusing on the following things when you're working on your first project. What am I doing that leads to the best customer experience? Is every purchase I make making the game better? I'll give you an example. Is spending a little extra to bring in a layout designer so that the game flows naturally and is easy to read and understand. That's a purchase that makes the game better. Purchasing additional art from an artist or additional art assets if you're buying one of those bundles, or you're licensing art, is a purchase that makes your game better. Hiring a professional editor, shout out to our editor Amy, is a purchase that makes your game better. Buying t-shirts for your Kickstarter is not a purchase that makes your game better. Focus on, especially for your first couple releases, focus on making purchases that make the game better. I cannot stress this enough. If you're worried about what to spend your money on, ask yourself the question, is this purchase making the game better? You will save so much more time, money, and headache on that one little mantra than you realize. And so it's really essential that you are making purchases that make your game stronger. And lastly, I'm going to talking about this middle point right here. I know that some of you are probably looking at it wondering, what does that mean? Know the value of 30 cents. I'm going to share one last anecdotal story about the importance of knowing your margins. Knowing the value of 30 cents. So some of you might know I released a game last year called You Have Always Lived in the Lighthouse. It has been by far and away our most successful project yet. It is a 2-player role-playing game where one of you is the lighthouse keeper and one of you is the sea monster from the deep that comes to visit the lighthouse. This is huge, and it's our most successful game by a country mile. It literally to the point that I have ordered more of this game in the last year than I have for any of our games within that same span of time. It's been great. However, during the process of the game, we were creating backer rewards, and so the backers were able to generate sample lighthouse keepers, lighthouses, and lighthouse creatures to go into the book. If you're a fan of the game, you will know these as the schemas. The schemas are essentially like campaign settings that you and your partner can set your game of Lighthouse in if you just want to try one of those. Super cool, super interesting. When the final book was done, I realized that we had 10 already ready-made lighthouses, characters, and creatures, plus the lighthouse keeper, creature, and combinations that were created by the backers. I looked through and realized that I could cut my least favorite of the schemas that we had made to make additional room, and by doing so, I saved 30 cents a book copy. Now, 30 cents doesn't sound like a lot, and it didn't drop the quality of the book. I do want to add this really quick right now, because the backers made such great schemas that I felt comfortable cutting the same amount of individual schemas that we had already had and just letting the backers' characters shine. So it actually, I think, made the book better, cutting the ones that I thought were the weakest, and it saved us 30 cents a book. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, Kyle, 30 cents a book doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, except it kind of does. So I've ordered 700 copies of this game in the last year. That 30 cents a copy translates to about $210 saved, or to break that into the things I can buy with that $210, that's 14 cover illustrations that I could license from Dean, who we talked about at the beginning of the video. That is 2 unique commissions if I wanted to commission a really good artist online, and $10 to buy myself a Chipotle burrito bowl afterwards, or it is the entire cost for a local show if I wanted to bring Desks and Dorks to a local convention. Full disclosure, a lot of the local shows that we go to, a booth cost is anywhere from $100 to $200, which means my 30 cents saved on those copies translates to making all of my games better, or allowing me to make an additional convention visit that I wouldn't have been able to make otherwise. That 30 cents translates into more opportunities to be successful as a company. That's the importance of knowing and understanding your margins, and that's why I stressed it so much. In summary, though, there are so many different ways that you yourself can make an RPG for dirt cheap. You don't need to rely on AI art. You don't need to rely on AI generated stuff. You can do this on your own and make something that I think is genuinely interesting, intriguing, and awesome. And I hope this has been helpful to those of you who are planning on or are in the middle of doing your first role-playing game project. Links to all of the resources that I talked about will be in the description below. I promise. Usually Editing Kyle forgets to put the links in the description below, but I have them all saved on a separate doc, so they will be in the description below this time. Please use them. Please go out, make great games, and I hope sincerely, I mean this with all the love in my heart, I sincerely hope to see some of the cool stuff that you all make later on down the line. So if this has been helpful to you, again, the YouTube pleasantries are really helpful to me. The best way to support us is to get our games. You can, of course, check us out over on itch.io. The links to our physical copies are also in the description if you want a physical game. And again, thank you to everybody that watches. I am Kyle Ott from Desks and Dorks. You've all been awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.